You're listening in on an animated discussion about Superman the Animated Series with two experts in their fields. I'm Joshua Unruh, superhero scholar.
And I'm Caleb Masters, your friendly neighborhood film critic extraordinaire from the cinematropolis.com. And today's topic is Double Dose.
Hello, listeners. It's Josh. Before we get into this episode, I want to give a content warning. Caleb and I both saw some disturbing sexual imagery in this episode, which is not something we've shied away from pointing out before. But this one gets a little more serious. And we recognize that we're two men talking about sexual violence to women, and we will do our best to be respectful and compassionate. But if you just can't deal with a discussion of a rape metaphor by two men, we will understand completely if you have to bow out. That said, if you do hang in there and you have either positive or negative thoughts about how we handled the topic, please let us know. All right, Caleb, that kind of difficult warning out of the way telegraphs where we're going to wind up going with at least part of this episode. But I feel like it's incumbent upon us to start with the positive, at least, because I do think there are some good things in this episode, even if there's a rot at the center that I can't quite get over. Would you agree?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, just on the label, when I saw this episode and the description for this episode, I was like, oh, this is going to be a good one. I mean, Livewire and Parasite, this is a natural combo. I mean, it certainly sets it up for some really cool, like, superhero shenanigans in terms of, like, their two powers working together to fight Superman. That's kind of cool. I like that.
Yeah, that stuff is really good. I felt like on a technical level, this episode is tremendous. Like, it's not the best or most intricate plot ever. It's, in fact, entirely uncomplicated, and it's super telegraphed that there's going to be a double cross at the end. But knowing that doesn't change the excitement in the ride. Like, it's two characters that do make sense as far as their powers working together, whose personalities don't make sense together at all. Now, that goes to a very dark place we'll talk about in a minute. But you're right. Parasite and Livewire on the label are a good mix. The animation, I think, is some of the slickest that we've seen on Superman the Animated Series. We have downplayed some of the action scenes in the past because they were just boring and unstaged. But I really feel like not just the fight scenes, but especially the action stuff is really well animated in this. And the set pieces are excellent. It really gives a sense of place to where they're having the set piece, and there is great movement, especially at the end in the power plant. So I feel really positive about the technical aspects of this episode. I think that you were a little cooler on it from a technical aspect, though. Tell me about that.
It was fun. Like, it didn't really stick out to me that much. I mean, I thought my favorite part about this episode was actually not really the set pieces as much as it was how Superman chose to fight them. I thought it highlighted, again, people frequently think of Superman as a big, dumb Boy Scout. And I think this is here for him to say, ooh, I have a problem I need to solve. And he thinks through it. Now, he's not Batman levels of genius or intellect, but he's able to problem solve in a really meaningful way. And I thought it made for kind of a fun little visual gag, seeing him wrapped in plastic, but also very clever. So that's the thing that stuck out to me. It honestly, at the end of the day, we're going to get into like how it made the villains look, but like it was an episode that made Superman look really good, like in terms of like what he could do and how he would choose to take on these two criminals who have powers that would seem to be a real threat to him.
One thing I really like about the plastic suit is that Lois was his inspiration. Like, she didn't give him the idea, but she inspired it. And that's a small moment, but as a person who is always thinking about what it would take for a person like Superman, Clark Kent, as down to earth as you can get. But the fact of the matter is his life is really weird. And he hangs out with like really incredibly competent and brilliant people. And so I love when I can see what it is that Lois does, even if she doesn't realize she's doing it. That is a real inspiration to him. Sometimes that's going really hard after the story and being all about truth and justice. And sometimes it's just because he is always thinking about her. And so when she does something, it gives him an idea for something else. I love that stuff. I really love that stuff.
We can get into the things that don't work here in a second. But I have one really important question, Joshua. And this actually set the tone for the whole episode. It set the tone for me asking all sorts of questions about this episode. Are you telling me the personnel, the security guards, or the janitors at this prison are not trained or notified of the powers of the villains that are in this facility? You're telling me that this janitor thought, hey, this supervillain that we keep locked down, whose name is Livewire, which she tells you her name, you're going to give her some headphones? You think that's a good idea? Holy Moses, what is going on, man? That guy probably needed to be let go.
I mean, they at least had a security guard say, "What are you doing, you idiot?" And made him give up his watch. But even after that, the janitor sneaks the Walkman in. And yeah, look, I love it. I actually think that's probably how 90% of supervillain breakouts happen, is that
totally.
Somebody just doesn't follow the HR manual, Yeah, he's really dumb. That janitor is spectacularly dumb, and I suspect that if he survived the prison break, his job probably did not.
And I joke, it was actually kind of funny, but I was like, oh, come on, man. She introduces herself as Livewire. She's locked down, and she asks to listen to to hold your electrical device. Come on.
It actually reminded me. Now, this is the janitor, whereas the security guard was really smart, but it actually reminded me of something from when we were just freshly starting this podcast. It honestly may have even been in On Leather Wings that I was watching it with my son, and he actually said, "Boy, being a security guard in Gotham got to be the most dangerous job in the world."
Oh, yeah. They do not get paid enough.
It just reminded me of this extremely genre savvy moment, with my kid. It was good. All right. I think that as much as I enjoyed kind of that aspect of the episode itself, as I mentioned, top of the show, just has a rotten core. And for me, it is completely rotten. We'll just lay this out there right quick, and then we'll talk about how you saw it and how we feel about it going forward. But this is the moment where, if you are still on the fence about the content warning, now's the time to bail. So let me say, maybe it's because I'm a father and I'm thinking about how these things look to my child. Maybe it's because I'm an old man shaking my fist at the clouds. And what I'd like to believe is that I've actually become a better human being, over the last several years. And the fact that this episode has a barely veiled rape plot is very disturbing to me. It's really uncomfortable to watch this episode because while it is a metaphorical rape, it is barely metaphorical. It is barely under the surface. I think it makes total sense for Livewire to see Parasite as a useful but dangerous idiot. She clearly knows that she's in danger and he's going to betray her as soon as he's able to. That's pretty good characterization for her. It's also entirely within character for Parasite to be a leering bro who can't keep his hands to himself and is always looking for an angle on Livewire, and I mean that in multiple ways. But the context of their genders and the sexual dynamics that are written into this episode make it super gross. And yes, it's a villain perpetrating the bad behavior. And yes, he's reprimanded. But when he's reprimanded, it's played for a joke. It's played for laughs. And it's also played like it's Livewire's job to stop him from touching her rather than his job to just control himself and be a better person. On many podcasts, I have been on the label that one of the things that makes superheroes great to me is when we take a literal problem and turn it into a metaphor that can be dealt with by punching and shooting lasers out of your eyes. That is not what's done here. It is done for prurient reasons. It is done for interesting character interactions that turn into gross character interactions. It's uncomfortable watch. And while this is certainly the second worst example of this that we've seen from this broad amorphous group of creatives, it's a thing we keep on seeing. And we've pointed it out as we've gone along and tried not to be scolds and killjoys about it. But at the point that we move from just male gazing, air quotes, just male gazing, to the point where we are doing barely metaphor rape plots, it's honestly, my nostalgia for this show took a beating during this 22 minutes.
So a couple things. Firstly, I didn't go as quite as far as you did, although I don't think you're wrong. I definitely walked away feeling a little icky about this particular episode, and there's a lot of reasons for that. It's, one of the things that you said about comics and even this show does really well is being able to talk about meaningful things via an allegory. And this episode sort of does the reverse of that, where you accidentally, I wouldn't say teach a bad lesson, because they just don't teach a lesson. It's sort of a little more neutral than it needs to be. Had they come out the gate and said this is not okay within the context of the story, then I think it could have been salvaged, but alas,
I agree.
Like you said,
that'd be a different conversation for sure.
Yeah, it's kind of like you said, played for laughs, which again, I think is, I don't think it's just these creators. I think it's a much larger problem that has been addressed in more recent years about just the treatment of women on screen. I mean, again, watching things from the 80s and the 90s. Frequently you're like, oh, wow, I can't believe we got away with that. And especially, and again, we've made progress even up until the Me Too era, but post Me Too era, this stuff just doesn't fly. And I think the thing that got me, again, we'll get into more specifics if we need to, but the thing that sort of made it more icky and more sexual than it needed to be was when the prisoners were fawning over Livewire like a sex object. And I was like, this is completely unnecessary. It doesn't do anything for the story other than a bunch of guys in prison are icky and gross. And then it also sort of sets the stage for framing this in a sexual way. So again, I think the idea that you laid out there is that this didn't have to be sexual, was possible, but they didn't go that route. And I don't know exactly why they felt the need to do that. Did they think it was going to be, was it played for laughs on the, again, framing it through the prisoners being just fawning over Livewire as a sex object? That felt kind of uncomfortable. And because you have that, then you start thinking about this whole episode through that lens of sexuality. And also the fact that there are male gazy things in this episode as well. It just sets the stage for a bad recipe. And yes, this episode is really about Parasite ignoring the boundaries set by Livewire. That followed by the sort of sexual nature of some of the advances we see and sexual framings we see earlier just makes the whole thing feel like it's trying to be a metaphor for something, but it's not really, or at least it's unintentionally saying things it's not meaning to say at best.
I mean, I think that it is safest for us as critics or as, just viewers who enjoy the piece. I think it's safe for us to say that we don't believe any of the people who worked on these shows got up in the morning and said, let's do some sexist, bigoted, misogynistic stuff. Let's do a rape plot in this episode of Superman. I don't know that was what, I don't think for a second, actually, that's what they got up in the morning to do. But I've brought this up before. There's a concept my Listen Up A-Holes co-host, Lonnie Diane Rich, brings up a lot when she talks about creation of stories. And it's a concept taken from wine growing, from wine making. And it's terroir. I'm probably pronouncing that terribly because I only had 2 semesters of French in college and it didn't go well. But the basic idea is that what's in the environment, in the dirt, in the air, in the water, gets in the grapevine, gets in the grapes, gets in the wine. That's where all the flavor from the wine happens. And the fact is, yeah, I think we've made some strides in the last few years as far as how, at least how if not in how women are treated on screen, at least in the conversation around it. But we haven't moved that far, which is depressing to me. And it's particularly depressing to me when I look back at something like this that was very clearly aimed at children at the time, very obviously aimed at children. I was a child at the time that it was newly running. And for it to be this misogynistic, for it to be this full of barely restrained and barely suggested as opposed to actually done sexual violence, it was tough. It was really tough. And you're right. They really set the stage for the sexualization of Livewire for no reason with the other prisoners. You've got it with Parasite. Everything he says is about stealing her power, but everything we see is him leering at her body or at her body parts.
I mean, there's a shot of her butt, and the up and down thing, like the male gaziness, no in there. I mean, like, and it's like,
yes.
it's like the idea of him wanting her powers does not inherently have to be sexual, but the way they frame everything, you're just like, oh, ugh.
Every single time it's framed that way. And every single time her rebuffing him is framed in the same kind of way that we would see women rebuffing unwanted advances in less enlightened media. Keep your hands off. It's physical violence. Now, I mean, they're villains. Set that aside. But it's always physical violence to get them off. She is placed in the position of being responsible for fighting him off. And again, I know they're two villains, and there wasn't a third person who could say I don't know what the better way to do it was, but I know that this was not a good way. It unintentionally sends the message or reinforces the message that so much other media puts out there, which is men can barely control themselves. It's up to women to keep them in their place. And when women are no longer able to do that, we shrug and move on with the story about the two men.
Well, and again, I think here's how you do it. You just don't make it sexual. Don't make it male gazy. like a man wanting to steal a woman's powers does not necessarily have to equate to man wanting to have sex with a woman. Those. Yeah. I mean,
or rape a woman, which, let's lay on the label, is different than a sexual interest. Like, rape dynamics are almost uniformly about power, not strictly about lust or sex. So yeah, like the wanting to steal a woman's power, awesome. A++ choice.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly fine. You don't have to make it sexual, but like just everything about the framework, the way she says, I mean, come on. She at one point says, when I say no, I mean no. I'm like, holy cow. So they know what, like, and that's why it feels like it just feels wrong, because it's like, and I don't know, maybe at the time it didn't mean the same thing. But today when I hear that, I think, oh, she is saying, stop coming on to me. You know,
yes,
that's not okay. And he continues to transgress that, and it's just icky. It's wrong.
Yeah. It in the end, it's gross to watch, honestly. I think. I don't want to say this as a judgment on our listeners, but I would say if you watch this and it doesn't ick you out a little bit, it might be a good time to inspect some of your feelings about how different genders interact and what's appropriate. And if you're a storyteller yourself or a writer, it's worth remembering how the genders of your characters can either intentionally or unintentionally shift the theme of your story. Do I think that they got up in the morning to make a Superman episode that is low-key, barely a metaphor about rape? No. Is that what they did? Yes. And it's messed up for it to be in this place and for it to be portrayed in this way. Very disappointing.
Last question here, Joshua, and I just am posing this here again. This is just like going through kind of my random sort of notes I took here, because again, more ideas that feel incomplete in this episode. Is this the first time we've seen Parasite absorb Superman's memories when he absorbs his powers?
It is not. That was a big deal in the very first appearance, and you remember at the end, of course, he was catatonic, and then when he showed back up, he just didn't remember, and now they've apparently, at least low-key, wiped his memory again. I love that part of his powers, and I think that you may need to set the bar higher, like in order to absorb long-term memories, he's got to hold on longer or something, you know, so that just brushing up against Superman isn't enough to do it. But the fact that they have so defanged that aspect, that danger of his powers, it's a wasted opportunity, I think, with Parasite.
It just felt like kind of like they randomly threw it in here. I mean, I don't know. I feel like Parasite so far has worked much better as a one and done villain. I think we if I recall correctly, we quite enjoyed that episode and that take.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Also they don't do, I mean, other than making him seem like a sexual predator, they don't really do anything with him to add to that character in any way in this episode, which is kind of a bummer.
I think that's absolutely true. All right, Caleb, very difficult conversation, but assuming people watched this episode and had some of the same feelings we did, both the positive and the negative, tell me, what are your alternate media recommendations? What other things should people be reading, listening to, or experiencing?
So I actually struggled quite a bit with this particular episode. So here's what I landed on. It's not a one-to-one, but if you like stories about people absorbing other people's powers and shooting energy out of their hands, there's a little video game franchise called Infamous that was a PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4 exclusive franchise. I don't think they've released one since the PS4 launch, so it's a little bit older, but it is a really great series about these people who are able to, like absorb powers and go do superhero like shenanigans, except for you're a little more of an anti-hero of that one. So again, the idea of energy manipulation with a superpowered being, that's pretty much the only tie really. But Infamous, great series on the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4. Joshua, how about you?
I'm going to take a little bit of a note from myself in our last episode, and I'm going to recommend another album. So, because remember, the part of this episode that I really liked are two disparate criminals working together and finding new ways for their powers to work together and taking on the world. And so I am going to recommend the Fun Lovin' Criminals' first album, Come Find Yourself, which is almost, but not quite, a concept album about doing crimes.
I've always wanted to listen to a song about doing crimes, Joshua. That's a great recommend.
There are several songs about doing crimes on Come Find Yourself, so I recommend it wholeheartedly. That about wraps it up for this animated discussion. If you enjoyed this conversation and would like to join in, come find us on Twitter. Caleb is at CMastersTalk, and I'm at Joshua Unruh, and the hashtag is Animated Discussion. Caleb, where else can people find you?
Well, Joshua, I'm the editor-in-chief and a contributor at the Cinematropolis, a website that specializes in in-depth film critique and analysis. We publish in-depth essays as well as our podcast, The Cinematic Schematic, covering all types of different films. And you can find all of those analyses and critiques over at thecinematropolis.com.
Remember that an animated discussion is a Pulp Diction Productions program and is 100% supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can keep this and our other shows in production, check out patreon.com/pulpdictionproductions. Show your support by pledging at Patreon or by leaving a great review on Apple Podcasts to make it easier for more people to find us and join in the discussion.
And of course, the links to Patreon, Apple Podcasts, our recommendations, and Twitter are all very easy to find in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us for this animated discussion. We'll be back next time to talk about Legends of the Dark Knight of the new Batman Adventures.
Until next time, look! Up in the sky! It's a bird! It's a plane! It's an animated discussion!